You say hello, everybody.
Hello.
Say aho, pini kara giwina. Hani shawida hampina. Ho chonga jila walking jo mani go hingadina. Naga market jila Henry Pear go hingadina. Hu jaki kita wajina. Egi China kate hachiaje. Naga ni shochija kate wine. Hamte wa ini ginopina. Wa ini ginopina. Say hello to you all. My name is Henry Pear. I'm a Ho-Chunk artist from the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. That's 15 miles to the south of us here on the Winnebago Indian Reservation. I grew up on the reservation, that's home for me, but I also went to school here at West High School before graduating at the Winnebago High School. I've always kind of been an artist ever since I was a young lad. I like to say initially it started at the University of South Dakota as something they have every summer. It's called the Oscar House Summer Art Institute. Every year it's about invites native kids, non-native kids to come for 2 weeks within the summer to practice their artwork and to learn about Yanktonai Dakota artist Oscar Howe, who's a local legend in the South Dakota area. So I was a part of that legacy early on. That's kind of where I was introduced to artwork, and where I seen that you can do art professionally as a career choice. And it was there they kind of persuaded me to attend college at the Institute of American Indian Arts located in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was there I went, studied, and obtained my Bachelor's of Fine Arts, graduating in 2008. I took a brief hiatus and kind of traveled a little bit. I moved to Victoria, British Columbia, and afterwards I was accepted and invited to come study at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I obtained my Master's in Fine Arts in 2013. Oof, okay. So that was a while. It was in between there and there. I've had little smaller jobs. I was also the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, as well as the Director for the Angel Decorah Museum and Research Center, both located in Winnebago, Nebraska. The last kind of official job title I had was the Collections Assistant at the University of South Dakota John Day Gallery. I started practicing my artwork professionally since about 2018, and aside from a brief collective pandemic, I've been working back and forth through my artwork. So that's kind of a brief background on myself. I'm going to give you an idea about the work that I've started with, as well as where I'm at nowadays. Like they said, I've also done the murals here on the other side of the building, and then local ones within my community down in Winnebago, Nebraska. So give you a little bit of start as well, a little bit of a brief little history crash course, I guess you want to say, on the Ho-Chunk people and how we have got here. Starting within the 1800s, the Ho-Chunk people have been removed a total of 5 to 7 times, depending on the year of when you want to count. The earliest were in 1829 when we lost our southern reservation, or not our southern reservation, excuse me, our southern lands in southern Wisconsin, and we're kind of collectively all moved to what's called the neutral ground in northeastern Iowa. And those places there still hold our names. Decorah, Iowa. Decorah is a name that we still carry, that's still a last name within our community. Some of my relatives and my ancestors are Decorah, and there's another town up there called Waukon, Iowa. Waukon is a Ho-Chunk word that has a few translations, one being a snake, and the other is a word for like the sacred. And so those are 2 places in northeastern Iowa that still hold our names. And afterwards, we were collectively moved to northern Minnesota at the Long Prairie Reservation between 46 and 1855 before selling the timber on that land in exchange for buying land at what's called the Blue Earth Reservation between 1855 and 1863. It was there we kind of collectively went through a tough time with our Dakota relatives, our Sioux relatives, and we were all kind of exiled out of Minnesota as a kind of a ethnic cleansing of a sort. And so that's kind of a part of our history that we all kind of share before we were all removed to Crow Creek, which is in central South Dakota. I'm sure if you're familiar with South Dakota, it's pretty flat, and the Ho-Chunk people, being a woodland people from Wisconsin, we found it difficult to live there. And so we sold that land in exchange for purchasing land from our Omaha people down here in northeastern Nebraska, and where we finally resettled. And that's how we have the Winnebago Indian Reservation in northeastern Nebraska. Throughout all those travels, all those relocations of physical removal, the Ho-Chunk people would always go back home to Wisconsin. And so that's why we have two separate branches of the tribe, the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin and the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. They're both the same people, just separated by place and history. Ho-Chunk is the name for ourselves. It's what we identify ourselves as. Ho-Chunk means people of the big voice. And the word Winnebago is a xenonym that was given to us by other people. A brief history on the word Winnebago would be when the French first had contact in Wisconsin, and they met the Menominee people, who are Algonquin speaking, and the French wanted to know about the place Wisconsin and other tribes and people that were living there. And so the Menominee people told them the Winnebago live at Lake Winnebago, hence the name Lake Winnebago. And it was a name that described a place, and it was the foul-smelling place. As I'm sure you are aware of, in ponds and lakes and waterways, it can kind of have an algae-rich smell. Sometimes it can kind of be a little bit rank, but it was in no way to kind of talk bad about the Ho-Chunk people who were living at that time on that lake. But when the French heard it, they anglicized it and put that spin on it, where they kind of bastardized the language. Excuse my language, but that's kind of a result of the translations between the different peoples. And so when they heard Winnebago, they described them as the Puan, which was the stink people. So it's different to have to talk about these things from a historical perspective and to give background on the names of both Ho-Chunk people and why we identify as Winnebago. So that's a little bit of a crash course. I'm sorry if it's a little heavy, but it's kind of who we are, and it's how we came to this area. So I'll kind of give you an idea about that, because that factors into a lot of my work about what I make and the work that I do today and what it's reflective of. And so I was initially trained as a acrylic painter, and a lot of the times we reference photographs. So this was Winnebago. He was a prominent leader during the 1860s, and he was one of the last people who kind of delegated for ourselves at the Winnebago tribe. And working from photographs allowed me to kind of work on the figure, as well as to see what colors complemented one another, just from a very artistic standpoint. And so these works are all from my undergrad when I was at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And they allowed me to kind of build upon, these kind of references. And so you'll see, this is the first introduction of the landscape and when it became a part of my artistic vocabulary. Shortly after, I had a graduate thesis show, and a lot of my work had to deal with our religious iconography, as well as our, the way that we are brought up, one of them being Christianity and the introduction of Christianity into Native worldviews. And so the Native American church was a big part of who I was as a young child, and still is today. But it also raised a lot of questions within myself and who I was internally, and to do more research about the things that we have lost within our relocation and removal, as well as the things that we have gained. And a lot of it was that Christian element. But also, it's important to show the humor about who we are as Native people. Native humor is a big thing. And sometimes it can be very specific, sometimes it can be collective. But it's always important to kind of showcase that, because these are a lot of the people that I see when I go home. When we're getting together, we're always laughing, we're always having a good time, and rarely do we have difficult times when it's not within our path. And so after graduation from my Bachelor's of Fine Arts, I kind of took some time just to kind of develop my own visual vocabulary. And this is very influenced by the Southwest, the bright colors, the kind of exuberant landscape, as well as the figure that I'm kind of trying to develop. And these became a lot more about making statements as artworks. Excuse me. So here's another one. This one's titled Up on Their High Horse. This is kind of something that I've always kind of, we always have to deal with the ups and downs of life, things that you can take you, one place you're on the top of the world and the next you're coming down to reality. And it was at this time I also wanted to reflect proper representation of not only my people, the Ho-Chunk, but my friends who I went to undergrad school with. So the person on the left is in traditional Blackfoot attire. The person on the right is in traditional Lakota attire, and the center of it being Ho-Chunk. And trying to develop those different themes. This one's reflective of our matriarchs, the women who raised us, and how we choose to honor them. For the most part, they take on a lot of burden and have to continue to develop that as a life skill. And so about 2010, when I was introduced to the mixed media, this is where a lot of the things that I've accumulated throughout my years of travel were starting to make their way into my artwork. And so this is a smaller piece where I utilized actual found objects and maps, things that I was collecting, travel brochures, as well as the ticket on the bottom left reminded me to buckle up and drive carefully. That's my actual ticket from getting pulled over. I was driving with no insurance, no driver's license, kind of just being up to no good, and had to kind of utilize that as a person, and that's what I was up to at the time, and to try to bring that back within my artwork. How do I express that visually? So still utilizing and referencing photographs. You can see how it's kind of being changed in terms of subject matter composition. So this was the first painting that I began making when I went to my graduate program. And it was one of those things where I had to kind of break out of my comfortability and kind of expand on whatever it is I'm going to be going through for the next couple of years. And so still trying to utilize that humor. And it's one of those things where you're contemplative, and it reflects itself in the title. It's, oh, it's my turn. So you're sitting there so long that you forgot that it's your move. But the top in the middle, right between the middle, is actual brochures of farmlands, from Nebraska, South Dakota, and putting that into the worldview as opposed to the previous ones where you see the dead buffalo. And being able to go back to these things, this is one of the works that I've came to during my graduate years. I was sitting at home up late night watching infomercials, doing studying, and trying to figure out where I was going to go next. And one of the infomercials that came up was the Snuggie, and I thought that was a great conceptual piece that you can utilize in terms of what they call going back to the blanket, which is a term that kind of denotes you're going back to your traditional way of life. So all the things that encompass the Snuggie, keep your hands and your warm free, you don't have to use that. Wrapped in warmth anywhere you go, and now smallpox free. So the photographs on the right were taken from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and there are 3 different photographs of Ho-Chunk people. One, the top right, being like more of a tourist one. A Ho-Chunk man is posed with a non-native woman, and the non-native woman's wearing the headdress. The middle piece is a older Ho-Chunk woman walking in a field, and there's a dome, our traditional household, with nothing on it. and the bottom is two severely scarred up young Ho-Chunk women with smallpox. And it was a very tough thing to have to grasp all those different realities that we have come to know. So this is the first introduction of the Winnebago. The Winnebago, as you all know, is a motorhome, and it was one of these things where I had to kind of decide, like, what's my next move going to be? How can I build that up? And collage has taken over at this point fully. So everything on this is more collage as opposed to applying paint. And so this is a delegation, a Winnebago delegation that went to Washington, D.C., and the title is Filling Their Heads with Words. You're kind of forced to be a Nebraska farmer, your ticket to freedom, implying the Winnebago motorhome, and at the bottom, free reservations. Well, as we all know, reservations aren't free. There's a cost to that. And it was about this time I decided to work in different bodies of work that would ultimately feed into one another. And so this was the Amalgam series, and it deals with identity and how we can be, for example, we have to depend on a blood quantum. You can be half Ho-Chunk and you can be half Omaha. Those are two different tribes, but you still make up one person, and you may grow up one or the other. And you kind of have to navigate that world within yourself. So here's a couple different examples. And all utilizing found objects. This is collage on a chalkboard, collage on a checkerboard. And I think this was after I graduated. I began to try to expand on that once again and to bring back the photograph once after making those ones in terms of just their breaking up the physical features of what constitutes a face or a profile. So a couple different examples, and the most recent being, okay, so this is another body of work that I came upon just doing my research at the Wisconsin Historical Society. This is a traditional art form. This is a woven utility bag with a Thunderbird design. It's made out of natural vegetal fibers, slippery elm, nettles, either buffalo wool or hemp, and then it was dyed. And this is from the late 19th century. These traditional art forms influenced another body of work that I became, that I still continue to do today. And so basically I was walking around in graduate school in Madison, Wisconsin, and finding, detritus, whatever I could find within the alleyways or on my walk to my classes. And I would stumble upon these old signs that they were either getting rid of or they were repainting, and I would bring them to the studio to try to, redevelop that traditional art form in a contemporary sense. How do I reinterpret those traditional designs, and how can I expand on them in a contemporary vessel? So this was another one. After I began making these bodies of work, people would bring me these objects. And so this was one of my peers brought this over, and she said, "This was my family's sign. Do you want it?" And I said, "Yeah, why not? I'll make some art on it." And so utilizing, found objects, the ceiling panels, the same ceiling panels that are up here are utilized on there as well. And then also being gifted the smaller, the more ones that are in like the maintenance rooms, and utilizing them same motifs, the Thunderbird design. And in our traditional stories, the Thunderbird, comes from the west, and he brings the rain, he brings the thunders, he brings lightning. But also without that, there's the other side to that, and it's the underground panther, the underground lynx, or the water spirit as we know it. And these two are contradictory to one another. One's above the world, and one's underneath the water, and they're in constant quarrel. So essentially teaching us as through these stories about the good and the bad and the things that you can't be too trustworthy of in terms of natural phenomenon and natural weather patterns. And so that's kind of displayed here. Show them in relationship to one another. And it began taking another step. How can I, make it so that, they're smaller, more compact, but they have a more potent statement. And then these became about, are you trying to decipher the words, or are you looking at the design in the middle? And it's a question about what we hold higher. Is it the sacredness or the deities or the motifs, the actual cultural art forms, or is it the nuances of our everyday life that we kind of just have to go through? So here's another version. And these ones kind of naturally developed onto paper bags. So the first one was actually a bag that could be utilized, and then now I'm trying to, reincorporate that same idea into paper bags. So here's the counter to that. And this one was actually made with motor oil. And so it was something that I experimented with, but didn't really know the end result. And when I poured the motor oil onto the canvas, it continued to bleed until the whole piece was filled with this kind of murky looking oily motor oil. And here's where these are currently at. So doing more research in different archives and collections. This one I think was at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and it's a kind of more geometric pattern. I'm trying to break away from that Thunderbird kind of water spirit. And this is another body of work that I developed in grad school. I was invited to our professor's homestead, and he had a couple acres and just kind of allowed us to do work on his land. And so this was a piece inspired by British artist Richard Long, he did a piece called Making a Line, and it was essentially him walking in one way back and forth till a path was beaten into the landscape. And so for myself, going back and forth from Nebraska to Wisconsin, it kind of rang true to what my ancestors have done, either being driven from Wisconsin or driving back to Wisconsin, or walking in that sense. And so it kind of helped me realize that these things weren't just something that my ancestors had done, but that I was continuing to do, going back and forth from Nebraska to Wisconsin, from my home in Nebraska to my home in Wisconsin. So this was just me walking back and forth on 1 acre of land until a path was developed. And this is another piece inspired by the landscape. When I first went home to Wisconsin, it was what I'm calling a re-intervention with the landscape. So being removed from that traditional homeland and then being allowed to go back X amount of years later and to assert myself within that landscape. And so this was a class project where we were to, I think the assignment was to alter the interior. And so what I've done, I've approached the University of Wisconsin's Arboretum and asked if I could do artwork on their property. They obliged under one condition: no phallic imagery, which was like a weird thing to me. I was like, there must have been some phallic artists going around in Wisconsin, but that was something that I wasn't interested in. So I told them my idea. They were like, okay, that's more what we were thinking. But they had this lodge, and basically I went around. I was still collecting that detritus in Madison, and I would come across just cardboard and anything that I could find, old business signs, and I essentially just wrapped this in a traditional manner that we would have done in our traditional homes. And so this was a 3-week installation. It was up there and it snowed twice. And so that's a few photos. This was the last one. I put a for rent sign there. It sold. It was a good experiment, and it was something that I just allowed people to interact with. People would come and they would either go inside of it or they would be kind of standoffish, like they didn't know if they should interact with it. So it was a good kind of a social experiment. So this is work I'm beginning to show post-grad after graduating. And it took me a while to try to kind of, just decompress from that kind of rigorous and kind of time-consuming element that I just put myself through. But it was essential in that learning experiment, And so this is another one, trying to fully utilize all the collage elements that I had within, that I've accumulated through those years. And so this is kind of speaking on that Winnebago name, just the different elements of it. So the top left is a group of Ho Chung Min, and on the right is a Winnebago motorhome. So this is a actual Winnebago brochure that I just collaged these Ho Chung Min on top of. 3 Ho Chung Min, not Winnebagos. But also, it's one of those things where I always have to bring the humor back into it, and that simplicity is one thing that collage allows for. And so this is a tourist season, as we all know in this area. The Native American population offers you to come out to the powwows and be a tourist and to be a part of that culture.